express for profile.
That's right. Justin and I did that.
Good afternoon, everybody.
His express passport, and that was 500.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just going through and muting just to get rid of some of that background noise. Sorry about that.
Right.
Welcome, everybody. Sorry, we're a couple of minutes late, but we got there. Cool. All right, we might get started, seeing as there's quite a few people here already, and I'm sure there'll be some more joining us over time. But good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We are recording the session, so if there is any issues and you need to hop out for anything, we will be sending that out after the event. My name's Summer. I'm the Projects and Events Manager for MPAQ, and today I'm just moderating the session. Today we will be talking about the obligations on employers in the management of first aid in the workplace and what the WHS Act mandates for employers. We are joined by Adrian Turner, who's the Head of Citation Safety and General Counsel at Citation Group. Adrian, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Everyone.
If you do have any questions throughout, feel free to pop them into the chat. Or use the raise your hands thing. We'll make sure we get to all the questions. If not throughout, we'll get to them all at the end. And yeah, if you are joining us on the recording, if you're watching this later, please, you can still add questions into the comments and we'll get Adrian to follow those up after the event as well. But that's enough from me. I will let Adrian take over.
Thanks very much, Summer. So I'm sure I've met or spoken to a number of you before by the MPAQ safety line, but for those of you that I haven't, thanks very much for that, Summer. My name's obviously Adrian Turner and I lead the MPAQ safety advisory line as well as my function with Citation. So we're going to have a chat today about first aid obligations in the workplace and obviously specifically in the plumbing environment. Oddly enough, it's questions about first aid and I know particularly questions about the requirement to have first aiders in a business and how many you need to have is actually a very common question that we get. And, you know, there are particular things that you need to be aware of as plumbers that I think make it worthy of spending some time on it today, because obviously it's so important in not only kind of making sure your people have access to, you know, treat injuries at work, but being compliant as well, and everyone's you know rightfully concerned about falling afoul of the Workplace Health and Safety Act. And so just to set the scene a little bit, even apart from work health safety obligations, it goes without saying, but I'll speak to it in any event that first aid's just really about preserving life, preventing illness or injury from becoming worse, relieving pain, promoting recovery. And I think that if you take that and then talk about the starting point for all obligations under work health safety law, and that's that employers have a duty to ensure, or a duty of care specifically, to ensure the health and safety of all workers in the workplace. And so I think that's the most important thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about anything related to health and safety, because everything and all of your obligations as a business come back to that ultimate duty to provide a safe workplace for your workers. So first aid, swims, JSAs, everything ultimately comes down to an assessment of, did you, in relation to this incident or something that happened, discharge your duty of care to workers so far as reasonably practicable? And so that applies to first aid as a simple concept as it does to everything in work health safety. And so if you take that basic principle, that first aid is kind of the immediate treatment or care given to someone suffering from an injury or illness until further, advanced care can be provided, like, going to a hospital. So you need to have provisions for it in order, if you're going to say as a business that we discharge our duty of care and had all the arrangements in place to keep people safe at work, obviously you're going to need to have arrangements in place for treating injuries when they happen. Otherwise, you can't really sit there and say, well, we did do all things reasonably practical, because you didn't even have arrangements in place to take care of people when they got injured, no matter how bad it is. So I think that's the most important thing, is that ultimately, yes, there are some specifics that you need to have in relation to first aid, but ultimately is really about making sure, as it is for everything else you have for health and safety, do you have arrangements in place to make sure that you can say as a business that you're discharging that duty of care to people and people are safe at work. And if something were to happen, there are arrangements in place as reasonably practicable to do something about it. So I think just to get into a little bit of the specifics. So the duties that you have is to provide first aid equipment that each worker in the workplace has access to that equipment, and that you have adequate number of workers in place at that particular work site to administer first aid if and when an injury occurs. And so that's one that often causes a bit of consternation across all industries. We get a lot of questions about that issue generally, and that's because there's actually no prescription in the work health safety legislation or regulations around how many workers have to be first aid trained. It depends on the circumstances. There's guidance given by WorkSafe. There's guidance given by WorkSafe that, you know, if you have a very high risk workplace, that there should be at least 1 in 10 employees who are first aid qualified, and if there's a lower risk workplace, it's 1 in 25, and if there's an office environment or something that's, you know, quite low risk, 1 in 50 is appropriate. But none of those things are hard and fast rules. It's all about what is going on in this workplace and how do we ensure that what's going on is covered in respect to the types of injuries that will occur. And so we'll get into a little bit more of that in a second. But, you know, the other thing that you need to make sure is that all workers kind of have access to wherever those first aid kits are, and the various equipment checklists and inspections that you would need to make sure that whenever a worker is working on anything in your workplace, they know that the first aid kit or the first aid arrangements in place at that workplace is in X or Y spot, and that they know that if something were to go wrong, that's where the stuff is that they need to do to treat it. So I think it's also important to keep in mind, we've spoken so far about, well, as a business, what do we need to do with work health safety? It's also important to think about that it's not just the business owners that have responsibilities in relation to first aid, it's employees as well. And so what that is relevant to is that when there is an injury that occurs and WorkSafe or whoever else is determining issues with it looks at the liability. If you have had, as a business, you've got the basic arrangements in place so far as reasonably practical. And what I mean by that is, you know, there's a trained first aider on site. There's a first aid kit that's equipped with the necessary things that need to be in that first aid given the industry. But it just so happens that a particular employee did not comply with their duties, which is seen on the screen at the moment, then the business is not held responsible for that if there was a failure in respect to the first aid treatment of that injury. And so they've got an obligation to take reasonable care for their own health and safety, to take reasonable care for the health and safety of others, and to comply with reasonable instructions, policies, procedures that are given by the employer in relation to first aid. And so what you're seeing on the screen there is kind of how you ensure workers do those things. But I think what's really important, again, is just to appreciate that you are protecting your business. Most important obligation that you have, or the most important consideration, is making sure no one gets injured in your workplace. That's obviously the worst thing that can happen for any business owner. But then obviously secondary to that is the compliance risk that's attached with not doing these things. So if you do these basic things that we're talking about in today's presentation, but despite that, a worker kind of flagrantly goes outside of it or doesn't do the things that you're asking them to do, which you're seeing on the screen at the moment. So they're not following your instructions. They're not, you'd completed a toolbox talk and distributed the swims and talked about the swims that was in place in that workplace, and that had first aid arrangements on there, but the employee flagrantly went outside of that. You're not going to be held responsible for that because you did everything reasonably practicable as a business. It was the worker who didn't comply with their obligations. All right, so again, we've touched on this a little bit, but I think it's just it is really important, and that's that there really are no hard and fast rules with health and safety, generally speaking, but in particular in relation to first aid, it's very difficult to give concrete black and white answers in relation to what are the specific things you need to have in place to be absolutely sure you can never be held liable for certain work health safety breaches. And that's because of that term that we've talked about, which is all of your obligations are as so far as reasonably practical. And what that means is determined by the circumstances in any one case and the situation of that workplace. And so what first aid requirements, like everything else in work health safety that you need to have as a business, will depend on the nature of the work that's being carried out there, the nature of the hazards at the workplace, the size and location of the workplace, and the number of and type of workers and other workers at that workplace. And so to take a really extreme example, obviously the first aid arrangements and other work health safety arrangements in my office environment are very, very different to what's required to be in place, on site, in a plumbing circumstance. And so that applies across all your work health safety obligations, but it informs what you need to have specifically for first aid in order to be sure that you're covering off on what's needed for first aid, because what needs to be in a first aid kit in my office and what the risks are that are present to me are very, very different to the ones occasioned on plumbers out in the field. And so a PCBU may not need to provide first aid equipment or facilities if they're already being provided by another duty holder at the workplace and they are adequate and easily accessible at times the workers carried out work. And so that's a circumstance where a plumber may be a subcontractor on a construction site, and as part of signing up to the swims of the principal contractor or vice versa, there are arrangements in place for first aid equipment at that work site that all workers know about and that all workers have access to. That would mean that you as a business wouldn't need to have specific first aid kits yourself in certain areas because you've covered off on your obligations based on the principal contractor or whoever it is that you're engaging with on that other site, satisfying you that those arrangements are in place. And so you just need to be able to check that as part of the same way that you would check what is the swims that we're working on and what are the health and safety arrangements in place at this workplace. You just need to have some form of way of being able to establish, yep, we knew there was first aid kits and arrangements set up at that workplace because we checked it off and here's our signature on the kind of work health safety system that we were signing on to. It's all relative and based on the specific circumstances at a particular work site. So I just also wanted to touch on, because I think it's really important and because it often informs again what needs to be in a first aid kit and what best practice, but also compliant practice is in relation to first aid kits, because what are the types of risks, the ways in which people can get injured on a plumbing site, and that therefore informs, well, what arrangements do we need in that work in the first aid kit. So these are some of the common, I thought I'd just take you through some of the common risks that you see and therefore what are the things that you would need. Power tools, they present serious risks if they're not used and maintained correctly. The most common injuries are the hands and fingers, as you'd all know, and eye injuries are often caused by different bits of shrapnel that might fly around or being cut out of ground by power tools. Falls, obviously a major cause of workplace deaths each year, using an extreme example, is based on falls, and so equally they can often result in head and neck injuries. They may not be fatal, but they need to be arrangements in place to treat that if it's a risk that's present in your workplace. Manual handling, again, there's a lot of this in just about everything that you'd be doing. So there's significant risks there. Handling heavy and awkward objects, being in uncomfortable postures and lack of space to move freely creates a really serious risk of injury. How do we treat that? They're the types of things we need to be thinking about. First aid kit. Equally hazardous substances, dangerous goods. So these are often used to carry out plumbing work. And biological hazards as well. Plumbers can be exposed to things like raw sewage when working on pipes or septic tank outlets. And so you need to have measures in place to prevent direct contact with raw sewage, but also arrangements in place in first aid kits to deal with it if and when it arises. Sharps, very important as well. This can include syringes and other potential source of contaminations, and electrical shocks, obviously, as well. So, I'm preaching to the choir around how you actually manage those risks. These are the types of, at a general level, the types of risks that you see covered off from in your risk assessments, swims and whatnot. But it's also the things that you need to have provision for in your first aid arrangements, and equally these ones on the screen. So burns, trenches and confined spaces, sunburn and heat stress, snake and spider bites. So again, and we'll just mention also on hazardous chemicals. Often the first aid arrangements, how you are to generally manage the risks associated with them, but also specifically how you manage the first aid arrangements will be provided for on the safety data sheets. So you're required to have a safety data sheet for any hazardous chemical, and then what that will also provide you with what are the control measures that you need to have in place for managing those. All right. So what needs to be in a first aid kit in the plumbing industry? Again, it's really important that you have a first aid kit that addresses all of those things that we've just discussed, because if you can't, then the argument would be that you are not compliant because you don't have adequate first aid arrangements in place. And so there are specific plumbers and gas fitters first aid kits available at retailers in the Queensland area. I'd highly recommend that these is the kind of the best practice first aid kit that you have. It's specific to your industry, and it allows you to be comfortable that it's got all the things that address all of the issues that we've just sort of spoken about. So it needs to have things like adhesive dressings and sterile eye wash, treatment for burns and spider and snake bites to cater for outdoor work risks, and everything that you need and to address those key things that we've spoken about will be in them. And so, yes, you can get a more standard first aid kit, and they will be sufficient in a number of circumstances. But given you can get a plumbing specific one that addresses all of these issues and gives you a little bit more comfort that A, people are going to be able to take care of when something happens, but B, will mean you'll be able to be compliant when there's any interrogation of an issue that occurs. That's what you're looking to do. So again, just to back over this, the contents of a kit is going to need to address all of these things: cuts, scratches, punctures, grazes and splinters, muscular sprains and strains, minor burns, amputations and major bleeding wounds, broken bones, eye injuries and shock. Again, whilst those standardized kits are fantastic, and I think that should be an easy starting point for anyone in the industry to use, what really you should be able to demonstrate is that what is in your first aid kit is related to a risk assessment that you have done for the workplace that you're going to be working in. And so, for instance, a SWIMS is a risk assessment, and in that SWIMS or other form of risk assessment, JSAs, Take 5s, etc., where you identify the risks that you're going to be managing as a business at a particular site, you want to be able to say what are the control measures that are in place to manage the risks if and when they arise. One of those things is going to be a first aid kit. And so you need to make that first aid kit relevant to those risks that you've identified in that risk assessment procedure. Because, I mean, you're more than likely going to have most of those things covered off in, for instance, a plumbing specific first aid kit. But you know, if you really want to take a belts and braces approach and be able to be sure that, yeah, for this high risk work site, we've done a risk assessment and we've identified all the hazards and risks and how we're going to manage them as a business, you want to have that evidence base to be able to put forward and say, and part of that was the first aid arrangements. And so a best practice approach would be always making sure there's a risk assessment of some kind, and that it provisions for the first aid arrangements that are going to be there. So just touching on first aid training, I think the first thing to keep in mind, like we mentioned at the start, is that there's no specific requirements under the legislation that says there must be X or Y number of first aid trained people in a work site at any particular time. There's guidance given, but what it says is that there needs to be, you know, adequate arrangements in place so far as reasonably practical. And so I think just to try to be practical about that, in a small business, you know, under 10 employees, you should make sure that someone is first aid qualified and trained, particularly the people who are out on the tools. I think that's a no-brainer. I don't think you could argue that in the you know, plumbing operations are not sufficient high risk to have someone trained at all times. And, you know, arguably you would need to have more depending on how high risk the work is that you're actually doing. But I think as a starting point, ensuring one person is first aid trained and undertaking some of these courses that are on the screen at the moment is a great start. Obviously, it can't hurt to have as many as possible. To have everyone who's working on a work site trained in first aid, I think, is prudent, albeit it's not a requirement. Mostly because it sort of fosters something that we've talked about, you know, a lot in these presentations, is that's the idea of a safety culture. If you're, you know, putting everyone in your workplace through first aid and demonstrating how important it is, not only, you know, about how we do first aid, but how we approach health and safety, generally speaking, I think it fosters a culture of, you know, of safety, which inherently means you're going to have less incidents, but also means that if and when, you know, an unfortunate injury arises, you've got people in place to deal with it. So certainly, I think, you know, if there are no significant barriers to doing it in a small business, I would suggest that as many as possible do a first aid course, and in particular do, you know, types of training courses that are on the screen at the moment. But you know, from a strict compliance perspective, it would be adequate that, say, 1 in 10 to 1 in 20 people are first aid trained in your business. But then you also are going to require, I think, to make sure that it's not just 1 in 10 in a business that's some workers along with some admin staff, that's someone at all times in the high risk part of the business, being the people actually performing plumbing operations, are first aid trained. So I would try to encourage everyone to make sure that at least one person at any site at any one time is first aid trained, and is kind of, usually that person is probably best placed to be the person who is most responsible for health and safety administration, such as, you know, providing the swims and doing risk assessments and things of that nature. Often the two go hand in hand, but like I said, I also think it's prudent to get as many people as possible doing these courses, because it's you know, it's a very symbiotic relationship between people who are trained in first aid and understand what causes injuries in the workplace, and a safety culture that prevents those injuries happening in the first place. So yeah, that's all I had on the formal part of proceedings. I'm happy to take as many questions as everyone has.
Right, thanks, Adrian. Does anyone want to speak up and ask any questions, either in the chat or just turn your video on, turn your microphone on so we can hear you. They're all shy. Everyone's shy.
Adrian,
There we go.
Emma from Master Plumbers. So a lot
Hi,
of
Emma.
questions that I get from our members is the first aid trained person might be the office admin person sitting in the office, and the plumbers are out on site doing the work. It's quicker for the ambulance to get there than for them to drop tools, go off and attend to the first aid. I guess what's the risk of that? So they've still got one person that's a dedicated first aid officer, but they can't actually get to the site quick enough.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it goes to that point in that, first of all, everything's kind of relative to the actual circumstances, but you need to be able to, for instance, if that played out and there was a significant injury, if there was something that was able to be performed in relation to first aid, and you would think that almost in all cases there would be something that a first aider could do on site, then if there were no arrangements in place, i.e. there was no sort of first aid equipment there, and there was no people able to administer first aid, then the likelihood is that there would be almost no consideration of the fact that the first aid trained person was at the office, because arrangements weren't there for when the injury occurred. And that's what I was sort of speaking to a bit earlier, in that you need to make sure that the people who are first aid trained are in the areas where the risks are to injury, because it's not this kind of, we just need to have someone trained in first aid, on a 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 basis, as long as they're somewhere working in the business, because they're not actually functionally able to perform first aid where the actual likelihood of risk of happening was. And it would all go into the mix of what the regulator would inspect and investigate. If there was a serious injury, they would say, show me a work health safety system in totality. What were the arrangements that you had to mitigate the risk of this injury happening? And if there were adequate arrangements, or the risk was not foreseeable in the context of that workplace, then you would be okay. I.e., someone got struck by lightning or something like that. There was actually systems in place for a decent workplace health and safety system in place, you would probably be okay. But if there was an injury that is relatively common, and for instance is linked to one of the risks that we talked about earlier that are common in the industry, and there weren't adequate, maybe there wasn't a SWIMS or risk assessment, and there were no trained first aiders at the site, despite it being a high risk construction site for all intents and purposes, you're probably going to be in a bit of trouble, because it would have been that they would consider it reasonably practical that someone be trained in first aid, because it's a high risk construction site at that site. So my recommendation there would be, definitely ensure that the people who would get as many trained as you can, but try to ensure that the people who are going to be on site, that there'll be always someone on site who's trained in first aid, so that you can stand behind that and say, well, we covered that arrangement off. We had someone trained in first aid at each site. If they can't do anything based on the nature of the injury, they can't do anything, but at least the arrangements were there to say that you did all things reasonably practicable.
Okay, great. Thank you.
We've had a couple of others come in. So Michelle wanted to know, or would love to know, recommended first aid kit providers. Do you have any?
Perhaps that might be easiest if we distribute that post the event. I don't have them to mind at the moment, but I can send a list that will take you directly to those specialised plumbing ones that I mentioned earlier.
Cool. Yeah, we can put that on the follow-up email. That's good. And it just says JH, not sure about the name, sorry. What about if no staff want to do the first aid training? What do you do in that instance?
that's more of an employment law question, but it's a reasonable direction. I think you can reasonably direct a staff member to do first aid, and particularly as it relates to your work health safety obligations as a worker, you rely on the worker having to follow instructions and directions in relation to work health safety, and provided that you adequately remunerate them based on the award for undertaking that course. I don't think that's not, they don't have an ability to get out of it just because they don't want to do it. That would be, in my view, a reasonable direction. And to the extent that they push back on that, it would be something that you need to manage as a disciplinary issue.
And Rachel wanted to know, they currently have first aid kits in the vehicles, just general vehicle packs. Would those be enough for the plumbers? Just says, would these be enough?
I mean, again, it sort of does depend on the so what's the nature of the work being performed at that site. Do all the people at the site know where the first aid kits are, and are there first aid trained people there? Like, there's usually, I think technically these days, to comply, what you want to be doing is having the plumbing specific one, so that you can say, well, we considered the specific risks that are likely to happen to us, and we had a first aid kit tailored to our type of industry. But it is also possible that in the context of a business that had a broader work health safety system in place, there was a swims done for that work site, people knew that there were first aid kits in the car, there was a first aid trained qualified person at that site. I'm not sure that, and I'd probably guess that it would not be an issue that the first aid kit wasn't completely and fairly, did not have all the types of things that you wanted in a sort of plumbing specific one. But, and the other thing I'd say about that is that if, for instance, you weren't held responsible for a number of things, or it was something that WorkSafe spotted in a normal inspection, it's not going to be something that's going to see a significant fine or any fine, to be honest, rather than just an improvement notice or can you make sure that better first aid kits are put in place. It's a very low, sort of minor issue if you have all those other good arrangements in place and your system is otherwise good. That's what I'd say about that. I'd definitely try to get the right ones in place. I realise there's a cost associated with that, but it's whether or not you'd be liable and there'd be an issue for you would depend on all the other things you've got in place.
Cool. And Sue asked, sometimes our workers are spread over multiple jobs on the one day from 3 to 4 different locations. Should or do they need to... Sorry, got quite covered up. Do they need to make sure do they need to have more than one first aid officer? If they're all spread out.
I would suggest it's prudent for them to do that. I would say, again, it would depend on the circumstances. So when you say, do you need, this all comes like when you determine liability and whether or not someone's done everything that's reasonably practicable, can only really be done having regard to the specific set of circumstances. And so whether or not, it might be that there's one sort of rotating foreman who's going around to all sites and checking on and supervising the sites. Generally speaking, he's first aid qualified, and the system is something that is, that business is built around. And so in that case, you probably wouldn't need to have someone who's first aid trained at each and every site. But I think the more complication you put into that, like the sites are a decent distance away from each other, and the rotating foreman or whoever it is who's going around to each site, isn't available, then it's going to be harder for you to say that you considered the specific risks in that business and put the right arrangements in place, because how can, because if an injury occurred at one of them, it was unlikely that one trained first aid officer would be able to do anything about it. And so if you have a business like that where there are multiple sites going on at any one time, which a lot of you would have, again, my suggestion would be, because of the nature of the work that you're doing and it being, technically speaking, in a lot of cases, high risk construction work, the expectation and therefore what's best practice would be, to have someone at each site who's first aid trained.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I think in our office, the course gets offered to everybody, so everybody is first aid trained. So then people that are off doing events and people that are off doing training courses.
Yeah,
and I think everybody is first aid trained. Leah asked, does the swims have to show the consequences of what could occur, e.g. the risks, the control measures, and then what could happen if control measures are not adhered to, e.g. serious injury, broken bones, death, etc.?
Not necessarily. That's a good question. There's a few layers to that. So first of all, technically speaking, the only thing that needs to be on a swims is provisions for the management of hazards and risk in relation to high risk construction work. So what are the hazards of this high risk construction work? That has to be in a swims. And then what are the control measures? And then often you'll also see, risk ratings and things like that. But the only thing that needs to be on the swims from a law perspective, a legal perspective, is these are the high risk construction activities going on. How are we managing them? It just so happens that a swims is also at its core just a risk assessment, and so it's a way of, yes, the law says you have to have a swims for high risk construction work, but because you don't want to have too many other documents running simultaneously for health and safety because it comes too confusing, it tends to become the general way that the business is going to operate and manage hazards and risks at that particular site. And so what tends to be on a swims from a first aid perspective is just where the first aid kits are, who are the first aid officers, if they're applicable, and what might be in the first aid kit. And so, and then the first aid kit obviously is part of the control measure in some cases as well. But at the end of the day, a first aid kit is only something that you use after an injury or an incident has occurred. And so often it is the control measures are more about how do we stop this injuries relating to these issues from occurring, whereas the first aid kit is about the treatment. And so you don't need to go, a lot of these sort of the types of injuries that occur as in relation to those hazards and risks, you don't need to list those out. It's about what are the risks and how do you control them, not what are the injuries that stem from those risks and how do you treat them. That's just that. People just need to know where the first aid kits are, who can administer it, and and more specifically, how do you actually stop those injuries from occurring in the first place, which is about the actual hazards and risks, not the injuries that stem from them.
Yeah, cool. And this one might be a good opportunity to plug MPAQ Safety, but because Angela asked, does MPAQ have a first aid risk assessment template? They work remotely in civil plumbing works in Western Queensland with 2 on site at a time, no first aiders. The general rule is to know closest local ambulance station, etc. is a risk assessment relative in this instance.
You would need to have first of all, you can do courses in remote first aid treatment and the types of things that you need to be doing in those environments, because it's a very specific type of first aid administration. And so I would firstly suggest that anyone in those types of businesses doing a lot of that work would consider putting the people who are in those situations through the remote first aid treatment courses. And then, apologies, what was the specific question around the first aid risk assessment? Yes, we do have a first aid risk assessment template that we can provide you. There is one in the manual that's in the system, but also if you reach out to me via email, we can help you out specifically if it's not something that meets your needs. And then yes, I would consider, I think for remote work, yes. Again, I'd sort of like to think about risk assessments and the arrangements in place for managing health and safety before the point of first aid. So absolutely, I think if people are working out in remote locations, then being sure that you as a business have the right first aid arrangements in place, being there is a first aider there, they have the right equipment, and they are part of your health and safety system. That's really important. But I would think for ease of administration, you kind of you're doing risk assessments on that activity and all the hazards and risks that relate to that remote work, as opposed to just necessarily first aid. So yeah, I would suggest if there are particular questions you have about arrangements like that, feel free to ring the MPAQ safety line and we can have a talk through it. But I do think that it's for ease of administration and for complying with your obligations and making sure people know how they should be doing their work. Risk assessment should be done in relation to this worker's going to that site, or this worker's going away for 3 days. We need to do a risk assessment for what the types of things that they're going to be doing on that trip, as opposed to just first aid. I think it's critical. It's going to be a critical component of how you manage those risks. But I would take a step back from the first aid specific one and focus on the more general risk assessment you need to do for that type of work.
Yeah, cool. And like Adrian said, with MPAQ safety, we'll include those details on the follow-up email. So if you do want to speak directly through to them, through Adrian, that kind of thing, about those types of things, then yeah, we'll have those details on there. Leah also did mention, Leah's on our membership team, and she mentioned that MPAQ, we also have some workplace health and safety core skills courses available, so they're a good tool for staff. There is a course called risk management and also manual handling and others like that, and there is funding available to be able to participate in those courses or put your employees through those courses as well. So definitely check out the MPAQ website for those. It looks like all the questions so far, unless anyone has anything last minute they want to jump in with.
Sorry, Summer, just one more question, Emma, from us.
Hi, Emma. Nice to see you.
Thanks, Bill. Just you might have touched on it just in the last sort of question briefly, but often maintenance plumbers will be working all around the place on so I guess
sorry, I'm not sure if it's me. I'm not sure if it's me or sorry, Emma, you're breaking up. I've missed that.
Yeah, we missed that. Sorry, Emma. She's up in somewhere. She's regional at the moment, so the internet connection might not be the greatest. Emma, can you hear us? That's okay, we'll skip her. Oh, well, Blake typed in a big question. Larger builders, sorry, bear with me. Larger builders, tier 1, predominantly supply a first aid office with access normally, which our swims and their general inductions refer to. In accordance with the new BPIC agreement, we have a requirement to have first aid trained people with a weekly allowance, so there is no issue getting people to do the course. However, as you stated, there is no guidance on how many we have to have or at what ratio. If we have multiple LAHA BPIC jobs at once, does the reasonably practicable become more of a nice to have, as the sites seem to be doubling and tripling up on first aiders, almost to the point where one in each work group would have one?
That's a great question, and the answer to that, I think, is yes. Quite simply, is that it is doubling up, and it is sort of going to that point of there's a number of PCBUs working in relation, like who are sort of working together in relation to those sites and under that arrangement. And so they have a responsibility to consult with each other and between them somehow make sure that the adequate arrangements in place for the safe performance of that work generally, but also as it relates to first aid. And so if via the SWIMS and the other work health safety system that you're signing up to includes a first aid office at each site, and everyone signs on to the SWIMS and is aware of that and goes through an induction and there is adequately in the business's satisfaction provisions for health and for the administering of first aid, which based on that set of circumstance you put through, I would say that there would be. I don't think you would need to have every single person or one person at each site necessarily, or have too much of a focus on it. If you're trying to get as many people as you can through, and that generally you have in regard to making sure someone from your business is first aid trained at each site, I think the additional layer of comfort you've got is that in some way, shape or form, you could, and a better way of thinking about this is I always like to think about if this was being interrogated or there was an incident that occurred, and part of the things that they were considering as to who was liable or whether there's going to be penalties that arise from this, is to pretend you're having to sit there and you need to be in a defensible position for sort of responding to what WorkSafe are asking you. And if as part of that, for whatever reason, there wasn't one of your workers at one particular site weren't first aid trained, but they were working on a site where there was a first aid office. There was a number of other first aid officers from other PCBUs. They'd gone through an induction. They knew all of the arrangements for health and safety, and they were working with a number of people, not just themselves. Then I think you would be quite well within your rights to say, well, we actually did review the health and safety system arrangements in place and were comfortable that, we'd done all things reasonably practicable. Because again, reasonably practical doesn't mean you do absolutely everything. It means, what's reasonably practical. It depends on the circumstances. And so I think in those circumstances, if you put yourself in that position where you'd have to defend it, I think you'd be quite within your rights to say, well, there were adequate arrangements in place. And that addresses that issue. So yeah, I think in that, again though, unfortunately the difficult thing is can't be just because that in that case it's okay. I think it doesn't necessarily mean in all cases it is, but where you've got a really robust and big major contractor running these sites, they're usually all over this type of thing. And so as long as at some level you're reviewing those arrangements and satisfying yourself that your people are going to be safe and have access to a health and safety system, then you'll be okay.
Cool. Emma managed to type a message. She obviously couldn't get the sound working, but she said her question was, often maintenance plumbers are working in customers' houses on their own, which could result in an injury happening that the business is not aware of. What should the business do to implement to have checks and balances in place to check on the safety of that maintenance plumber without feeling as though they are being micromanaged?
Yeah, I mean that's relatively difficult. I mean, you need to, as a business, make sure that whoever that worker is working there has access to first aid arrangements. So if it might be that one individual needs to be first aid trained and understand that, what he is to do in the case of an injury where he doesn't have access to anyone to provide communication back to the business or otherwise, and that's where you spend your focus. And so if as part of the swims or other risk assessment that you're doing, there are arrangements so that they know, hey, if they're an injury and you can't get to your phone or you can't do X, Y, and Z, this is the protocol that we want you working to, then that, because it's just a reality, there's any number of hundreds of plumbers who are working under those circumstances at any one time. And so you just need to be able to make sure that can the business again satisfy itself that person going and working in that situation, are there adequate safety arrangements in place? And part of that consideration is they're working alone. Is there a way at all times for that worker to contact someone to get assistance if there is an injury? And that's the key thing, in that, yes, probably in their car, they're going to have that. So first of all, they'll need to have a first aid kit in their car, but to satisfy that obligation. But what would be important is that there are arrangements in place that they can contact someone if they get injured themselves and they can't, access their phone or whatever the case may be. There just needs to be something that they know that there's a protocol for that, because otherwise it's harder to say that you put the adequate arrangements in place. So it's more about the protocol. If that's something that's happening regularly, then if the protocol is to access their phone and contact X person, then that's fine. But what if the phone's not available? What are they to do? And there's not a straightforward answer to that, but it might be that you know, it's a common thing, and that there's something the business thinks that it can do in the absence of being able to use the phone. So distress alarms and things like that. But a lot of that time, you know, it's a little bit overkill to consider those types of things in the context of residential plumbing, but those are the types of things in those settings that people do, distress alarms and other things that are more common in remote and isolated work.
Cool. So they don't need to have carrier pigeons on them or anything like that.
No, maybe 100 years ago.
Cool. All right. Again, looks like the questions have paused, but if I talk a little bit, maybe some more will come through again. But yeah, I think I got everything. I'll just scroll back through quickly, make sure I didn't miss anybody. Looks all right. Well, yeah, thank you so much, Adrian. I'll just start wrapping up, and then if anyone does have anything last minute they want to throw in, feel free. But yeah, that is most of the time that we've got today, but thank you for presenting and for providing the information. I think we've got Jovi online. Hopefully she took a note of everything we need to provide to everybody after the webinar,
Yeah, no
but
problem.
we'll get all that out on email afterwards along with the recording of today. Just for your information, for everyone still online, we do have quite a few other online events this year, as well as all of our usual in-person events and training courses all over Queensland, including our Plumbing and Gas Industry Awards, which we're pretty excited to be hosting at the brand new Queen's Wharf this year. Nominations are still open for those, and a lot of the award categories do have quite a big safety aspect to them as well. So please get yours finalised by next Friday. And you can also purchase tickets now as well for the dinner on the 11th of October. But otherwise, nothing else has come in. So did you want to add anything further, Adrian, before we wrap up?
No, just encourage anyone, if they've got, you know, safety related concerns, if you want to ring the MPAQ line, and in some circumstances, if you, particularly as it relates to something that I've spoken about in a presentation or to you before, feel free to ask directly for me and talk through it.
Cool. All right. Looks like that's about it. We'll let everyone go, but thank you for your time, and we will hopefully see you again at the next one.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.